Good morning. This is perhaps, surely, the last day that the Senate and House will be in session in the calendar year 2025. And so we expect members to be coming and going if their votes and their schedules permit. We welcome our distinguished panel today. 30 years ago this week, leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia signed the Dayton Peace Accords and ended the Bosnian War. At the time, the war was Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. More than 100,000 people died, and 2 million more were displaced. The war's most ghastly atrocity was the Srebrenica genocide in July 1995, in which Serb forces massacred 8,000 Bosniak men and boys in a UN-protected safety zone. Jolted by revelations of this genocide and the spiraling security situation, U.S. leadership spearheaded peace talks in the fall of 1995 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Today, we are gathered to assess Dayton's legacy and discern its future. On the one hand, time has proven the agreement to be extraordinarily durable. 30 years without a significant breakdown in security is a remarkable accomplishment. We'll never know how many lives Dayton saved, but we can be certain that an entire generation of Bosnians have been born, raised, and are now watching their children grow up in relative peace thanks to this diplomatic breakthrough. That's the good news. But as Bosnia and Herzegovina's former High Representative Patty Ashton once remarked, Dayton was a superb agreement to end a war, but a very bad agreement to make a state. The Constitution contained in Article 4 of the peace deal was intended as a starting point for the country to mature into a multi-ethnic democracy. 3 decades on, though, it functions more like a straitjacket. It constrains the Bosnian people and their institutions from transcending rigid ethnic categories. Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitution divides virtually every facet of political life among the country's 3 constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. This framework lends itself to zero-sum political calculations. It has been plagued by strange distortions in electoral representation that fail to satisfy both Dayton's intended ethnic balance and the country's stated ambition to join the community of liberal democracies. In fact, the European Court of Human Rights has ruled multiple times that Bosnia and Herzegovina's electoral system is incompatible with democratic principles given its privileging of ethnic identity, a privileging that disenfranchises various categories of citizens, including minorities. The past 30 years have also seen political paralysis, corruption, and patronage predominate. This has contributed to a feeling among Bosnians that Dayton is a dead end. Ethnic nationalist leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina keep getting stronger by creating division so they can stay in power. Because of this, many people have left the country to find opportunities elsewhere, and this should be no surprise. As a result, the population has dropped from about 4 million in 2000 to less than 3 million today. Thus, Bosnia and Herzegovina finds itself at a crossroads. On its current trajectory, it may muddle through without a descent into war, but its population will continue tanking. Its hope for a more prosperous Euro-Atlantic future will never be realized. One alternative path would have the country embrace political compromise and reform to right the ship, making hard choices to purge corruption and put Bosnia and Herzegovina on a path toward EU and NATO ascension. But every day that Bosnia and Herzegovina leaders decline to take this path, malign actors strive to drag the nation down another darker track. Ethno-nationalists, such as recently ousted Republika Srpska President Milorad Dodik, threatened to tear the country's multi-ethnic fabric while abetting Russia's strategic goal of preventing the region's Euro-Atlantic integration. Dodik and his accomplices, with backing from Belgrade and Moscow, have for years been driving toward the de facto secession of Bosnia and Herzegovina's Serb identity. Indeed, Dodik is Vladimir Putin's preferred vector of chaos in southeastern Europe. But he's not his only lever of influence. Bosnia and Herzegovina must also contend with its reliance on Russia for 100% of its natural gas, among other forms of leverage. I'm almost finished. After 30 years, the United States continues to have a significant stake in Bosnia and Herzegovina's pursuit of a democratic, prosperous, and Western-aligned future. And I can tell you that members of the United States Senate on both sides of the aisle feel that way and are debating that issue and discussing it on the floor among ourselves at, this very week. But our support cannot be unlimited, and the timeline for progress cannot be open-ended. Earlier this year, I was pleased to join Senator Shaheen, the retiring New Hampshire senator, in introducing the Western Balkans Democracy and Prosperity Act, which was included in the FY 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, which passed the Senate yesterday and will undoubtedly be signed by the President in the Oval Office this afternoon. This legislation lays out a vision for U.S. leadership in the region, and it is a vision that prioritizes economic growth, democratic resilience, and collective security while driving out Russia's corrupting and destabilizing influence. Russia's corrupting influence and destabilizing influence. It also prioritizes empowering our European allies to take leadership roles in the region, a crucial step, and we hope to have sustainable reforms in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm looking forward to hearing from our expert witnesses. They will address the key questions facing Bosnia and Herzegovina today. How can the nation advance beyond Dayton? Should we aim for gradual transformation or wholesale reform? What role should the United States play in the country's future? And what of European leadership? What can the international community contribute if Bosnia and Herzegovina's own leaders have failed time and again to lead the way? And with Russia playing its hand in Bosnia and Herzegovina, how should the Western world respond? I want to ask our witnesses to address lessons we can apply from Dayton to ongoing efforts to negotiate a peace settlement in Ukraine. While these are quite different wars, there are interesting parallels. All our witnesses have deeply engaged in debates and projects focused on peace building in Ukraine. I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panel. First, we will hear from Dr. Christopher Chiviz, and did I pronounce that correctly? Hot Dog, Director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Then we will speak with Ambassador Clint Williamson, Senior Director of International Justice at Georgetown University. He also serves as presiding arbiter for the Brško Arbitral Tribunal in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we look forward to hearing about that. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Paul Williams, the Rebecca I. Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University, who serves as a member of the Bosnian delegation during the Dayton Peace negotiations. I thank all these distinguished witnesses for appearing before the Commission today, and I look forward to their testimony. We are beginning to be joined by distinguished members from the House of Representatives. Congressman, do you have any opening statements, or shall we proceed? Thank you very much, and we're glad to have you. Are you going to get finished today?
I
think so. All right, hot tamale. We will then begin with Dr. Chivas. Sir, you are welcome to proceed in your own fashion.
Chairman Wicker, distinguished members of the Commission, thanks very much for the invitation to testify on Bosnia and Herzegovina 30 years following the Dayton Peace Accords. So the historic peace agreement that was initialed in Dayton, Ohio on November 21st, 1995 was one of the great diplomatic achievements of the post-Cold War period. The United States ended the violence in Bosnia by wielding coercive threats against Serb forces and negotiating with our main adversary in the war, Slobodan Milosevic. We saved countless lives and gave the people of Bosnia and the broader region real hope for a better future. So 30 years later, the question that we need to ask is, what are Dayton's lessons for U.S. policy in the Western Balkans and beyond? Speaking as a former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Europe, my argument is this. If Dayton is a reminder of what tough diplomacy can achieve, it's also a reminder of how different the world is today. There is no way to return to a 1990s-style U.S. interventionism in the Balkans. Instead, the United States needs to support a pragmatic, European-led strategy for the region. You see, when Richard Holbrooke negotiated with Milosevic sitting next to a B-2 bomber in Dayton, Ohio, the United States was in a position of undisputed global hegemony. Its Soviet foe had collapsed, and no new challenges had emerged. Europe still stood at the center of global and economic power. Central Europe, however, was unstable. U.S. officials feared that ethno-nationalist violence in Bosnia could destabilize the whole region. And this situation gave the Balkans special strategic importance for the United States. In short, when America intervened in Bosnia in 1995, it possessed unparalleled power to influence the course of events, few urgent competing global demands, and a major economic interest in stabilizing Europe. Even then, however, I'd point out, some analysts questioned whether the Balkans were important enough to warrant the investment of U.S. power and influence. That's why President George H.W. Bush chose not to intervene, and why President Bill Clinton waited almost 3 years before giving the green light. Today, the United States approaches its strategy toward the Western Balkans under very different geopolitical conditions. America faces the most significant challenge to its global interests and power in decades from China and Russia. In these circumstances, we need a strategy for the region that respects America's historic role, but is pragmatic about what we can achieve there with the resources that we have available. So to me, this moment clearly points to the need for Europeans to step up. Bosnia faces serious challenges of political dysfunction, nepotism, corruption, secessionism, and economic stagnation. These are the kind of problems that the EU is best placed to address. Europe also has a much stronger interest in addressing these problems in the Balkans than the United States does. It should therefore be expected, even required, to shoulder the political, financial, and military costs of keeping the region from deteriorating. Now, to be sure, I sympathize with those who find the EU sometimes frustrating and doubt its capacity to achieve rapid change. I mean, the EU moves slowly, its members disagree, it has a big bureaucracy, and, let's be frank, the EU will not revolutionize the Western Balkans overnight, but neither will we. We shouldn't compare the imperfect reality of an EU lead in the Balkans to a fantasy in which America returns to the region in full force. I just don't think U.S. interests elsewhere in the world would permit that, nor do I think the American people, at least to the extent required to make it succeed, would permit it. Meanwhile, we have 6 Western Balkan countries that seek to join the EU, and the promise of EU membership provides a great incentive for them to make the reforms that they need to advance the principles that undergird the Helsinki process. One effect, in fact, of Russia's war in Ukraine is that it has re-energized the EU's interest in enlargement to the region and given rise to some really creative new thinking about how the EU can do better there. Montenegro and Albania might even join the EU within the next 5 years or so. So the United States should support and coordinate with this renewed EU effort wherever it can. It should return to a position, importantly, of support for the EU on the Peace Implementation Council, which is, of course, the international body that has overseen the peace in Bosnia since Dayton. Washington should also use its own implements, including diplomatic support, technical assistance, and to the degree available, humanitarian aid and development assistance to build a stronger and more resilient regional economy and further the rights of citizens. It should leverage specific tools like the Development Finance Corporation to offer local leaders real alternatives to the Russian and Chinese financing that you, Mr. Chairman, referred to in your opening remarks. So, to conclude, the Dayton anniversary reminds us of what we achieved in Bosnia, but it also reminds us of how deep the region's challenges are and how much America and the world has changed since. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, it's a pleasure to be here this morning and to address you on the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Currently, I serve, as you said, as Senior Director for International Justice at Georgetown and as lead coordinator for the joint U.S., EU, UK Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine. Much of my work over the past 30 years, though, has been in the Western Balkans. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I currently serve as presiding arbiter for the Brčko Arbitral Tribunal. I succeeded former State Department legal advisor Robert Owen, who had been in that position from 1995 until his death in early 2016. As we mark the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Accords, I would like to focus my remarks today on this Brčko arbitration regime, which serves as an important Dayton enforcement mechanism. By way of background, this arbitration came about due to an impasse that arose in the late stages of the Dayton negotiations, when the parties had broadly agreed on a division of territory between Republika Srpska, the RS, and the Bosniak Croat Federation, but could not agree on a resolution of the status of Brčko due to its strategic location. This impasse, which threatened to derail the entire process, was broken when President Milosevic suggested to Secretary Christopher that he would be willing to submit the issue for international arbitration. Christopher agreed, and under Annex 2 of the Dayton Agreement, an arbitral tribunal was established, comprised of 2 national arbiters from the RS and Federation, respectively, and with Owen as the presiding arbiter. Anticipating a likely stalemate between the 2 nationals, the presiding arbiter was empowered to make unilateral decisions on behalf of the tribunal, and when the final award was issued in 1999, he ended up doing just that. Owen ruled that a newly created Brčko district would not be awarded to either entity, but rather would be held in condominium between the 2, would enjoy significant vestiges of self-government akin to those of the 2 entities, and it forbade the entities from any interference in the district's affairs. Additionally, Owen mandated the appointment of a Brčko supervisor to oversee implementation of the award. This official has always been a U.S. diplomat, now dual-hatted as the principal deputy high representative. Thus, maintenance of Brčko's status has very much been an American project, with the 2 principal guarantors, the presiding arbiter and the supervisor, both being current or former U.S. diplomats. Owen also inserted a powerful enforcement provision into the award. He dictated that if either entity breached the terms of the award in a significant fashion and thereby threatened the status or security of Brčko, the tribunal reserved the right to award Brčko to the exclusive control of the non-offending entity. This provision has been an incredible deterrent to the RS in particular, since the loss of Brčko would cut the entity in half and sever the land corridor between the more heavily populated western half of the RS and Serbia proper, an existential threat to the entity and one that has led the RS to shy away from actions that might be in violation of the final award. This guarded approach has mitigated interference by the entities in Brčko and has allowed it to become the most successful multi-ethnic community in BIH. Its 3 ethnic groups live in close proximity to each other, its children attend the same schools, and its political leadership is comprised of representatives from all 3 communities who generally work well together. Brčko has its challenges, but in terms of day-to-day interethnic tolerance and integration, it has been a success story. And this is ultimately an American success story. The long-running U.S. diplomatic, legal, and political investment in Brčko has created the conditions which have allowed this to occur. In retrospect, the U.S. focus on Brčko ended up being strategically brilliant in terms of ensuring stability in BiH. This may not have happened by design and ironically was facilitated by Milosevic's request. Brčko's strategic importance, though, and the safeguards put in place guaranteeing its autonomy and security have undoubtedly served to deter reckless behavior which would have impacted the stability of BiH as a whole. BiH today continues to face challenges from those intent on undermining its viability as a unified state, manifested in its most extreme form by calls for secession and active efforts to cripple state-level institutions. Sadly, those working for a unified, truly multi-ethnic state are a distinct minority. The entrenched sectarian political parties invariably work at cross purposes and rarely in the interest of BiH as a whole. Some of them, as you mentioned, are abetted as well by malign actors such as Russia, which seek to foster instability in the region by weakening Bosnia. Short of meaningful constitutional reform or surprisingly rapid advances in the EU accession process, BiH will continue to exist with a degree of political dysfunctionality that makes international engagement necessary. From the U.S. side, this would hopefully come in the form of continued support for the Office of the High Representative and the Brčko Tribunal, which serve as firewalls against the most egregious conduct by malevolent actors. At a more fundamental level, U.S. policy should be grounded in the understanding that a breakup of BiH, likely combined with renewed armed conflict, would have an impact far beyond the country's borders and would serve only to benefit Russia or our other adversaries. So it is critical that we maintain strong support for the integrity of the state and state-level institutions, and that we bolster those working toward these ends and actively oppose those who do not. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And Dr. Williams, you have
Chairman, Commissioner, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. Nearly 30 years ago, I served as a pro bono member of the Bosnian delegation at the Dayton Peace negotiations in my capacity as their lawyer. At the moment, I'm currently serving as a pro bono lawyer on President Zelensky's Independent Advisory Commission on the peace process. Now, anyone looking at Bosnia today undoubtedly scratches their head and wonders, why are there 3 presidents? Why do they rotate? Why is there a federation within a de facto confederation? Why are there ethnic vetoes? Why is political representation based explicitly on ethnic lines? Unfortunately, the answer is often, well, the Bosnians chose it. The Bosnians wanted it that way. Well, that's not exactly the full story. I appear today not to relitigate Dayton, but to explain why it succeeded in ending the war and why it was never designed to create a framework for governing Bosnia and Herzegovina in the long term. And also how we are running the exact same risk today with the Ukrainian peace process, which is all about a deal to end the war and not about an agreement for long-term security of Ukraine. Now, Dayton succeeded in ending the war, but it was negotiated under conditions of moral compromise, extreme coercion, and the urgent need for the deployment of NATO forces to protect the people of Bosnia. Those conditions shaped an agreement built to stop violence, not to lay the foundation for a functioning democratic state. Understanding that distinction is essential to understanding both Dayton's successes. Chairman, as you noted, it was highly successful, but also its enduring limitations that now need to be corrected. The Dayton Constitution was negotiated and signed under an extraordinary and deeply troubling constraint that is rarely stated plainly. 3 of the 4 signatories of the Dayton Agreement were indicted or considered indictable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. You can see the parallel again today that we have with Ukraine and the indictment of President Putin by the ICC. Only the Bosnian signatory, President Ali Izetbegovic, was neither indicted nor considered indictable. That asymmetry matters. A constitutional order forged by leaders responsible for atrocity crimes was never designed to govern. It was designed to entrench wartime goals and interests. At the time of the Dayton negotiations, Bosnia was under extraordinary duress. The country was facing an ongoing genocide, widespread sexual and gender-based violence, and the near collapse of its remaining territory. Sarajevo was entering its fourth winter. Again, unfortunately, we see the parallels with Ukraine. During one of my meetings with President Izetbegovic during the negotiations, he was candid. Sarajevo would not survive another winter. We need 30,000, 40,000 NATO troops. Give me the dinner menu, I'll sign it, so long as it includes NATO troops being deployed to my territory. At the same time, international protection had proven deeply unreliable. Srebrenica massacre, the near collapse of Gorazda, the UN-NATO dual key was inhibiting the ability to successfully protect the population. Against this backdrop, Dayton became, above all, simply a pathway to deploy these troops. One vignette that sticks in my mind is when we met with the mediation lawyers to negotiate changes to the Constitution. The Bosnians had over a dozen fundamental changes that they wanted to make to the Constitution. They were told, you get 2 or 3. Wait, we want this Constitution to govern our country, to function effectively. Don't worry, this is just for the interim. Just give us 2 or 3 issues. Later that same day, Richard Pearl and I, Richard was also advising the Bosnian delegation, sat with General Wesley Clark and his lawyer and went through the Implementation Force Annex, which was Annex 1, line by line. And General Clark explained all of the reasons why there were these obligations and why there were these constraints, and took into consideration each of our concerns. Only acted on 2 or 3 of them, but heard them all out because it was appropriate for there to be a complete and detailed understanding. Now, the question before us today is not whether Dayton worked. It did. The question is whether we are prepared to acknowledge its limits, as you have, Chairman, in your opening remarks, and to support the next phase of the unfinished peace that Dayton has made possible but could never itself deliver. And the second question is, with these 30 years of hindsight, how do we avoid making the exact same mistakes by applying this approach with Ukraine, which will be exceedingly vulnerable if it has a dysfunctional governance system or a Dayton-type deal to get to an agreement? Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Wow. Representative Veazey, I think I'll turn to you at this point. Representative Mark Veazey has been a valuable member of the commission now for several terms of Congress. I appreciate his participation and his interest in various visits that we've made to Europe. And so for whatever comments you'd like to make, Congressman, you are recognized, but also for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Wicker. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to ask Ambassador Williamson a question about Russian destabilization. I know that there's a lot of secessionist rhetoric in Republika, excuse me with some of these pronunciations, Republika Srpska. And I was wondering what policy tools and whether they are diplomatic, legal, or economic should the U.S. use to prioritize to counter these trends without escalating the tensions?
Well, as Senator Wicker mentioned, there have been, very credible allegations of cooperation between SNSD, the ruling party in Republika Srpska, and the Russian government. Clearly, a relationship exists between President Putin and former Republika Srpska president, and you did a great job of pronouncing it, actually.
Oh, thank you.
Of former RS President Milorad Dodik. Dodik has gone to Moscow on numerous occasions. has tried to cultivate this relationship. I think it's very clear that Russia has an interest in trying to create instability in the Balkans, and they certainly have focused those efforts largely on Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think it was very important, though, that we have seen now Dodik removed from office as president of the RS. He had been convicted by the Bosnian state court of various crimes, and then these were upheld on appeal in August of this year. At that point, the United States primarily, but other countries put pressure on Dodik to leave office. Eventually, he did. He has remained as chairman of the SNSD political party, but getting him out of the leadership of the government, I think, has been critical. There are indications that the RS government that is now in place is perhaps not quite as close to the Russians. They don't have maybe the same personal ties that Dodik has had. But I think the Russian threat continues to be very real. I think this is something that requires unified response from the U.S. and our NATO and EU allies to continuously confront this. It's not easy with everybody's eyes on Ukraine, but I think we shouldn't lose focus on what's happening in Bosnia and the fact that because of the attention that's on Ukraine, Russia is trying to exploit the situation in Bosnia and to do everything they can to get away with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you also, too, just about the some of the corruption issues. I know that that some people think that there's a serious threat posed by corruption and the political patronage systems to Bosnia's democratic institutions. Do you think that there's anything that the EU and the U.S. can do to better, coordinate to help support some judicial independence there?
I mean, corruption is a huge problem. It has been endemic. I just touched on this in talking about Brčko, where I said it has been a very successful in terms of achieving sort of a multi-ethnic status, which is unique in Bosnia. But corruption is pervasive there. There is a sense among people that in order to get positions even in private enterprises, you have to have linkages with the various political parties.
What's the population of Brčko?
The Brčko district is around 80,000 people. The city of Brčko is about 40,000.
Okay, so relatively small.
It is relatively small, yes.
And so this would be corruption at the municipal level.
There is corruption there at the municipal level. But I think because of the attention that is focused on Brčko, it has been held in check to a certain extent. When you talk about Bosnia as a whole, corruption is, as I said, is a huge problem. And there is, I think, general agreement, as Dr. Chivas said, that the EU accession process is going to be critical to Bosnia's future over the long term. A large part of that are rule of law reforms that have to be implemented under Chapter 23 of the EU accession process. And they have to combat corruption as part of this. So there is some pressure on Bosnian officials to do this, but it is, I think very few of them see this as something that is time sensitive. If you're a political leader in Bosnia, right now you're looking at this and you're saying EU accession is something that's going to happen 10, 15, 20 years from now. So why should I take a political hit, do difficult things, like pension reform or curtailing kind of these corrupt practices from which my political supporters benefit for something that I'm not going to see the dividends of? And, so there's very little incentive for the political leaders to move forward on this in a meaningful way, whereas the population, very much desires this, or most of the people do. and would love to see progress on this. But it is a slow process. It is a very cumbersome process. I think initially the EU questionnaire, as they called it, that was sent to Bosnia, had something like 3,000 questions that had to be answered. I mean, it is a difficult process. But this is where a lot of these efforts to combating corruption are going to have to take place, is through the EU process. But I think also by the work that we're doing in terms of linking investments there, trying to have a unified front between the U.S. and the EU on these issues, and also really standing the ground against kind of incremental efforts to chip away at rule of law. I mean, Dodik was a master of this. He would go out, he would make these maximalist demands, and there was a tendency to, well, let's give him something. Let's give him 5% of what he's asking for, which was great for him. He pocketed it. He moved on. He did the same thing a couple of months later. He pockets whatever he can get out of that. And so I think there does need to be a strong stand and recognize that, this incremental chipping away, as I said, of rule of law, of good governance, is something that we cannot allow if we want Bosnia to succeed over the long term.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're joined by Congressman Jake Ellzey of Texas, and we very much appreciate his participation. Congressman, do you have any statement to make, or do you have some questions?
Sir, I just have a couple of questions.
Okay, great.
If
You're
they haven't already been addressed, I apologize for being late. It's difficult to find offices in this building. We never come over here.
Well, we're going to have to rectify that.
We should. I just need to get lost one day in here and just give myself some time to get around.
But you are very welcome here, and thank you very much for your participation. I know y'all are busy, as we are, trying to finish up the session and
Trying to finish up. Yes,
enjoy
sir.
Christmas.
And I'm glad to be joined by my colleague from Texas and my neighbor in the North Texas area,
right.
Mark Vesey. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Russian destabilization and influence has taken root in a way that it hasn't since Stalin, and I'm concerned about it, and I'm concerned about how we address it going forward. It seems like corruption and destabilization go hand in hand, and that's something that they're urging. And while we lament it and say it shouldn't be, why we don't engage ourselves is because of corruption. It's never been a means for not engaging with other people, and especially winning World War II with when we joined with Stalin to beat and defeat a greater enemy. But corruption is a natural byproduct of dictatorships falling by the wayside into something else. And I'm not calling them democracies or even republics, but as they restabilize, corruption is a part that takes years to root out. Are we seeing, and this is for, you're all qualified to answer the question, Wagner influencing anything in Europe? And the second question I have, or in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the second question I have is, does the new NSS have second and third order effects that give destabilization entities an opening to destabilize places throughout as we spread west through Europe?
On one of the reasons why corruption is so endemic in Bosnia is because the structure lends itself to corruption. If you have ethnic vetoes, if you have a presidency that rotates every 6 months, the politicians perpetually have a bite at the apple. So it's much, much easier to corrupt or to be corrupted by the politicians because they can deliver in the negative. It's difficult for them to deliver in the positive, but if you want to stop something, you can easily do that by working with a corrupt or corrupting a politician in this system because it's designed to both break, B-R-A-K-E, and to break, B-R-E-A-K, the political process. I'll leave it to my colleagues to address more specifically the Wagner Group and their implication. On the NSS, since we're being frank here in this public hearing. I'm a little worried about Europe take the lead. For one reason why Dayton was so successful was after 3 years of the atrocities and the genocide under European leadership, President Clinton and Secretary Christopher Dick Holbrooke took the lead. America took the lead, brought them to Dayton, stopped the war, and it was the American NATO forces that were so important. The Europeans...
The UN had tried for 3 years.
Yeah, they had tried. The UN had tried, the massacre at Srebrenica, the near collapse of Gorazda, the dual key veto, all of those things that sounded good on paper but were devastating for the people of Bosnia. And then the European peace plans. Knock them if you want. It's the way the Europeans go about. There's this magnet of Europe, and as long as we can pull these countries towards Europe, things will be fine. It works in some instances. It has not worked in Bosnia, and that's the second tier, third tier knock-on effect of the NSS. Yes, they need to up their game on NATO. Yes, they need to look themselves in the mirror, but we still need to act in partnership with them in a symbiotic relationship in order to keep them on the right path, both in Bosnia and in Ukraine.
Just as to your question about the Wagner Group, they have not been hugely impactful in Bosnia. There was a recruiting effort that they launched trying to get Serbs in Republika Srpska to go to Ukraine, and they were able to recruit some that went out there to fight on the Russian side. And I think they've done like some sort of demonstration thing with some of these Russian motorcycle gangs where there's some crossover with the Wagner Group. But beyond that, I'm not aware of a significant impact by Wagner in Bosnia, fortunately.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, let me ask you this, Dr. Williamson. You described some pretty severe corruption in Brčko, and yet it's the model for the rest of the country. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I don't want to overstate the problem. At the same time, I don't want to downplay it. I mean, it is an issue, and I think as Dr. Williams said, it has been certainly propped up by the political structure.
Have there been any prosecutions, convictions?
There have been some prosecutions, yes, but you know they generally have been low-level prosecutions. I think there is a degree of impunity that is enjoyed by senior officials, at least a perception of that.
Well, describe the corruption.
A lot of it goes into sort of kickbacks that are associated with contracting. So this is corruption that takes place at kind of the government procurement levels. You also have corruption in kind of help with people getting jobs where there is payoffs in order to get positions, that type of thing. So, I mean, you have both petty corruption kind of at that lower level, but also at these higher levels where you do have it in sort of the procurement sphere. Again, I don't want to pick on Brčko in that regard. It is a problem there. But I don't think that's unique.
It's a problem in the whole RS. Okay, what's good? Tell us again, and people have, we have a larger crowd now. What is good about Brčko that would be better in the entire RS?
Well, I think the fact that the entities have and the entities being Republika Srpska and the Federation, the Bosniak Croat Federation, have been excluded from kind of active engagement in Brčko. They cannot exercise any governance there. Their presence is minimal and is minimized under the final award. This has largely allowed Brčko to be this more successful multi-ethnic community. As I said, the children go to the same schools. Children go to the same schools in other parts of Bosnia, but they go at separate times and they study separate curricula. In Brčko, they're sitting in the same classrooms together. They have erected the only multi-ethnic monument to victims of the war. So it's a joint monument to victims on all sides. The political leadership works relatively well together. Again, comprised of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks. The mayor is a Serb, the deputy mayor is a Croat, the president of the district assembly is a Bosniak.
Is that entrenched, is that enshrined in requirements, or it just happens to be that way at this point?
There are soft requirements, but it's really more of a gentleman's understanding, gentleman's agreement between the three in this division of post, but it also relates to the political strength of their parties, and it is one of the things that they have done is I think which really has benefited Brčko is that the political leadership has seen the value in cooperation and collaboration among themselves. And they really make a concerted effort to avoid getting drawn into the heated rhetoric that comes out of Banja Luka from Republika Srpska politicians or from Sarajevo. And they always try to distance themselves from this. So it helps to kind of cool tempers, diffuse tensions there. And this is by far the most positive aspect of what has happened in Brčko. As I said, there are some negative issues. There's corruption. There is still this underlying mistrust between the ethnic groups. There is population loss, as you talked about, for Bosnia as a whole. And there's economic stagnation. So all of those problems that exist in Brčko, take place on a wider scale throughout the whole country. But the fact that Brčko has been able to achieve this kind of multi-ethnic cohabitation level of cooperation is unique. And I think it is almost exclusively a result of the U.S. involvement and engagement there over the past 30 years.
Dr. Chivas and Dr. Williams, do either one of you want to weigh in on this topic before we move to something else?
I would only say that whether or not the United States can play the same role in Brčko the same role in the rest of Bosnia that it's played in Brčko would be something that we would have to consider. I mean, that would be a substantial increase in America's role. If I could, I wanted to comment on the NSS question that Representative Elsie had posed before.
I mean, feel free to interject.
Okay.
We'll proceed informally if it's all right with all of.
Fantastic, because I think it's a very important question that you raised, Representative. There is some indication that Milorad Dodik, who is President Putin's closest ally in the Balkans, has actually taken some encouragement from the passages of the NSS that are skeptical about the European Union. Why is that? Because he sees the EU, and I think this is also true of Russia, as his main enemy in achieving what he wants to achieve. And so, I'm not going to take a position on those passages. I'm just putting this out there as an empirical sort of fact that I've heard from people on the ground. Insofar as the NSS, I think rightly goes in the direction of, rebalancing America's role in Europe, there may be a tension between that objective, which requires supporting the EU, and the critical passages that are, giving encouragement to individuals like Dodik.
And Dr. Williams.
Yeah. I'll just pick up briefly on the Brčko point. For perspective, I believe one of the reasons why Brčko has been as successful as it has been is that it was exempted from most of the Dayton Agreement. Brčko was, we're here, we're at the end, we're ready to sign. There's this place called Brčko. We've gotten 48 to 48. What do we do with it? I don't know. Let's give it to Owens. He can arbitrate it and sort it out. And it was almost as if it was carved out of all of the other constraints of Dayton. I think that gave it space to be
What's
successful.
the ethnic breakdown in Bershko?
So the Bosniaks are I can give you the exact numbers here, sorry. So Bosniaks are 42% of the population, Serbs are 35% of the population, and Croats are 21% for the entire Brčko district. For the city of Brčko, Serbs are right at 50%, Bosniaks 44%, and Croats are 4%.
Representative Elsie. And again, gentlemen, just feel free to interject. We have a small enough crowd.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I wanted to ask on the Dr. Williamson on the corruption piece. What is there at least an effort, whether it's a feigned effort or what have you, to do big media events to show that they're trying to root out corruption? Do you have any arrest and conviction rates when it comes to corruption?
I don't have information on the number of cases or arrest rates or how successful these have been. A lot of my career has been focused on the war crime side, so not so much on corruption. But we have made the United States made a huge investment in rule of law in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I served previously as the ambassador at large for war crimes issues. We did a lot of the funding for the Bosnian state court, have worked with the international prosecutors, international judges there, and have tried to bolster efforts to build rule of law. So I think that, and the EU has done this as well, and there has been an investment in trying to tackle corruption through these state institutions. I think it has made some inroads. But again, I don't want to overstate the problem. I don't think it is something that totally undermines the functioning of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've been in a lot of other places where corruption is worse than it is there. Okay. But it is something that I think requires our continued attention, and ultimately it's something that will benefit from the EU accession process, because there are so many benchmarks that have to be met that will put in safeguards that help to tackle corruption.
I could comment on this as well. I mean, I think, around the world, corruption is a big challenge, and unfortunately, we have more cases where it has remained a challenge than cases where it's been resolved. There are cases in Europe where it's been resolved. Estonia is an important example of this. Estonia managed to root out corruption that was not unlike that in Bosnia at the beginning of the 1990s. It did it by moving very quickly and with a new generation of people who came in, and it completely reformed its whole politics. I want to...
Some of them moving back in.
Yes. I'd like to just reinforce what Ambassador Williamson said about the role of the EU so that it's clear, because as I said, the EU has moved very slowly, and I think Ambassador Williamson rightly explained that, at the local level, what's the incentive to change your ways if EU membership is 10, 15 years off? It's been stalled and moving slowly for the last 5 or 10 years. There's not enough pressure. That is very true. That may be changing in the EU, however. I was just there last week. Most of the people who I talk to who follow this are energized, by Ukraine. They want to get the EU going again. And they're thinking up creative ideas about how can we make this more attractive in the near term to the people of the region. So they're coming up with ways to reform the EU accession process in order to overcome this problem. And I think we should support that, in order to help to resolve it.
Okay, well, let's move to Ukraine. Gentlemen, how long has there been the term Balkanization, which is what we see in the Balkans? And we really don't have that much of a division in Ukraine. My impression is that there are different languages spoken, but there's a definite identity in the entire country of Ukraine as being Ukrainian and not anything else. So what are the distinctions, and how can we learn lessons from such a different culture?
I can go ahead and jump in and give it a quick
Please do.
pass overall and then turn it over to my two colleagues here. Senator, you've tapped on a strength that is incredibly valuable and incredibly necessary to preserve. So prior to the Russian war of aggression, there were a variety of identities in Ukraine. You had Russian-speaking Ukrainians, Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, you had Russians living in the West, all mixed up. Today, when you ask anyone from Ukraine, oh, what community? What is your identity? I'm Ukrainian. Full stop. They don't then start to give it different flavors.
Dr. Williamson, you're nodding your head.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Chivas? All right, go ahead. Well, go ahead, but I'm interjecting. I'm not stopping you. Go ahead, Dr. Williams.
What we need to be careful of is that we don't, through whatever peace plan we pursue, balkanize Ukraine. Now, one can
Actually, that's what Hitler tried to do in the Sudetenland and in Poland. Isn't that correct?
Exactly.
Exactly the same type of nonsense that we're hearing today, and that some people in positions of responsibility find instructive, was being used by Adolf Hitler several decades ago.
to create or amplify identities that then balkanize Poland, the Czech Republic, efforts to balkanize Ukraine. We need to make sure that we don't facilitate those efforts in our approach to the peace process.
Who else?
Just maybe if I can, and to pick up on this and to go back to this other point about EU accession as well. The work that I'm currently doing in Ukraine, and just to be purely transparent there, we are doing this pursuant to a grant from the U.S. State Department, so just to be very clear. But the work that we're doing in Ukraine, we're working primarily with the Office of the Prosecutor General on their investigation and prosecution of atrocity crimes. One of the big pieces of this is trying to have the Ukrainians draw on lessons from Croatia. And it goes back, as you're saying, I mean, you certainly can go back to what Hitler did. What happened in Croatia in 1991 under Milosevic's impetus was very similar to what Putin has done in Ukraine. It was carving out these autonomous territories and then having intervention from Serbia proper in order to protect the Serbian minority in Croatia. It tracks almost identically with what Putin has done. And
Knowledge of history is very important.
very important, yes, sir. And so the Ukrainians have been very open to Croatia's experience because they see so many parallels between what happened to them and what is happening in Ukraine now. And then the added element of this, which is the EU piece, is that Croatia was the last country to join the European Union in 2013. So they were dealing with all of these issues as they were going through an EU accession process, as Ukraine is now doing. They were the only member state of the EU that has had to deal with war crimes on their territory since the advent of the Union. So there's so many things there that the Ukrainians have latched onto based on Croatia's experience. And the Croats have been very good at explaining this and saying, look, we're not here to tell you what to do. We can tell you all day the mistakes we made, so hopefully you avoid them. But I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from, going back to certainly to World War II, the way Hitler approached these things, what had happened in the wars in former Yugoslavia. But I think, as Paul said, Dr. Williams, it's very important to make sure that we don't end up balkanizing Ukraine. I think that's a critical point, and it's something that we do need to avoid at all costs because it is a unified country. And many of our interlocutors, they speak Russian as a first language. And, you know, they're in the office, in the prosecutor's office, they're talking to each other in Russian. Russian was Zelensky's first language. And so they, you know, but they have a Ukrainian identity, no matter what their language is. And, you know, I think it is very important that as some sort of peace process goes forward, that we make sure that we don't do anything to undercut that.
Dr. Chivas, yes.
I completely agree, Mr. Chairman, with your assessment that what Putin has done in Ukraine is very, very close to what Adolf Hitler did in trying to create a greater Germany in the 1930s. I think we have to be a little bit cautious about how far we go with the analogies of that kind, and I'd be happy to talk about that.
Please do.
But it's complex. It's a complex subject. I don't think that, at least my own
Well,
assessment.
I'll cut you off at 20 minutes.
Everyone will appreciate that, sir. I think that you know, Russia poses a major threat, the biggest threat to Europe, and the biggest threat that it's faced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That does not mean that Russia intends to imminently march its way across Europe once it has finished with Ukraine in the same way that Hitler did in 1939 through 1941. So I think we just have to bear that in mind when we look at the parallel. From a nationalism perspective, because originally you asked about Ukraine, Putin has done more to create modern Ukrainian nationalism than anyone else ever could have by attacking it. And I think that is one of the big flaws in his strategy, is that his war has created exactly the country that he was trying to prevent from coming into existence.
Yes, Representative Elsie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been dying to speak about this since Ukraine came up, and we need to keep beating the drum. Year 4, people tend to lose interest. You think about Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1995. I was 25 years old. I was on my first deployment in the Navy. You ask how many people in the U.S. House were even around when Dayton occurred. Nobody's going to remember that. And the problem with human nature is we tend to forget history and we go off to the next bright, shiny object, specifically here in the United States. And once we settle something, we leave, we go on something else. So Bosnia and Herzegovina is an extremely, and Dayton is something we need to update and be aware of and talk about going forward. With respect to Ukraine, Ambassador, I know you're working on the war crimes, and the Hitler analogy is useful, but I think more useful is the balkanization, in my opinion, of Ukraine. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm happy to admit it when I am, despite being a Texan, is that Stalin started the balkanization with the Holodomor in the 30s. And the reason that people speak Russian in the eastern side of Ukraine is because of Stalin. The flag fell, and then Putin picked it up. And for me, and I've said this publicly a number of times, for me, Crimea is the Sudetenland. We have to do dealings with a war criminal who has conducted genocide through, even if you take the kidnapping of tens of thousands, I don't know what the number is, you're probably more familiar, I don't want to throw a number out there. Once you kidnap children, that is a genocide. That is a balkanization. And what he has done, yes, has made nationalism a very big deal in Ukraine. However, dealing with a war crime must have a moral aspect, a tone to it before we make a deal. There must be a moral compass that we have when dealing with a war criminal who, by the way, when our mouthpieces on the right talk about corruption in Ukraine, the world's largest gangster and corrupt leader in the world is Vladimir Putin. So I don't make the moral equivalency of, well, we can't support them because they're corrupt. Good Lord. Putin is the most corrupt man ever in history. So can we talk about the genocide in Ukraine just a little bit?
Sure. So I was already working with the Office of the Prosecutor General in 2021 in Ukraine. And so when it became clear Russia was going to invade, in working with the State Department, we started looking at how we could provide a much more operational response to Ukraine if they did in fact invade. And so I was on the ground a week after the Russian invasion at the border, the Polish-Ukrainian border. First meeting I had with the Ukrainians, you know, and this goes to this kind of sense of nationhood you were talking about. You know, one of the first things they were asking me is like, what should we be doing? And, you know, I was talking about different kind of contingency plans they could make, and one of them was for what they needed to do if Kyiv fell. And at that point, you know, the Russians were on three sides of Kyiv. Every Western intelligence agency was giving it a week, 2 weeks before it collapsed. When I said that, their reaction is, Kyiv's not going to fall. You know, and it's that spirit that has sustained them for 4 years. I see that waning to a certain extent now. I think, you know, they're very tired, they're worn down. They are concerned about what's happening in terms of the peace process, where this is going to end up. But, you know, there was this really coming together in Ukraine that created this national identity that probably was never as strong as it is now. But in terms of the war crimes, at that first meeting I had with them, this was already a week into the Russian invasion. At that point, they were citing that I think they had registered 300 war crimes cases in 1 week. Now that number is around 204,000. So that number is somewhat exaggerated. There will be duplicative reporting, some things that are common crimes, but it's still going to be tens of thousands of cases. It dwarfs what happened in the Balkans. And I've worked on atrocity crimes issues all over the world for 30 years now. I've never seen a place where you have had this sort of systematic approach of kidnapping children, resettling them, Russifying them, you know, that has taken place in Ukraine. And it is certainly a strong indicator of genocide.
Yes, sir.
If I could just jump in, Congressman, to add a couple of thoughts. Earlier, we discussed that 3 of the 4 signatories of the Dayton agreements were indicted or indictable for war crimes, and that's why you have such a dysfunctional constitution. At the time, Dick Holbrooke was asked, why are you negotiating with Milosevic? And he said, well, you know, he is the arsonist, but he's also the fireman. That wasn't actually true. General Wesley Clark was the fireman and then the NATO troops that were brought in. And I think it's important, at some point in time, Putin may have to consent to whatever the peace plan is. But every single day that the Americans negotiate with the Russians, they should get up and they should read the cover page of the indictment of stealing children, kidnapping children, and think, oh, that's right, that's who we're negotiating with. We may have to give him this much to get to yes, but let's not pretend that he's the fireman and that he's interested in a durable peace in Ukraine. The value of accountability for war crimes is it sheds light on the nature and the intent of the individual that you're negotiating with. And you should be reminded, not you, but who's ever negotiating should be reminded of that every single day.
Would a vote to that effect in both houses of Congress be instructive?
I'm going to go with yes. 5 points for yes. I see Chris wants to.
I was just going to ask, what would the vote be exactly?
There's legislation proposed that would call the, well, of course, the war crimes are legion, but also would call the kidnapping of children a genocide, which is absolutely recognized under every international protocol and law. So comment on that. It would be helpful to us. We've had a hard time getting that to the floor.
I mean, forcibly taking children from another, you know, national, ethnic, religious group is cited in the Genocide Convention as indicative of intent to destroy in whole or in part one of these groups. So I think this is probably the strongest argument for genocide in Ukraine. It's something that we have certainly been focused on in our work with the Office of the Prosecutor General, and I know that they're very very attentive to this. It has also featured in the work of the International Criminal Court, and this initial indictment that they produced against Putin and this woman who has this Orwellian title of children of, children's rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, who is the one that's kind of orchestrated this.
I would just add,
Yes, and I'll tell you, I think at this point, I know we have votes scheduled around noon, so you can respond to that, Dr. Williams, and then we'll go in reverse and let you do some wrap-up comments, and we'll go back down the table.
Okay.
If that's all right with you, Congressman.
Yes, sir. I got only a couple minutes left anyway. Thank you.
perfect. Just one sentence on that last point. As you mentioned, Congressman, folks will forget, things become opaque, they can become confusing. Passing legislation brings moral clarity to what's happening. It reminds everyone who tend to forget and tend to get caught up in the news of the day, there is an individual responsible for genocide at the table. May have to be there, but Congress plays a very important role in moral clarity. As Ambassador Williamson noted, the legal basis is clear.
And that individual's name is Vladimir.
Vladimir Putin, yes, and his gang of thugs.
Any wrap-up comments, sir?
Dayton was a peace deal, not a peace agreement. It was designed, cut a deal, end the war. It wasn't really designed and wasn't marketed to the Bosnians as designed for a durable peace. 30 years later, let's recognize that. Let's work with the Bosnians to rework it. And 30 years later, let's not make the same mistake with Ukraine.
Dr. Williamson.
So I would just echo that. I think it's, there are a lot of lessons that can be drawn from Dayton, but I think it is critical that we distinguish what Dayton was able to do and what it was not. It did stop the war. It stopped the killing. It was incredibly successful in that. It is held for 30 years. There has not been renewed fighting, but the ethnic carve-outs that took place under Dayton have not served Bosnia well over the long run. And so I think it is just critical as we approach some sort of peace process in Ukraine, is that this not become something that is entirely transactional, but that we look at what we are trying to achieve over the long term. If you do not build in a degree of justice, a feeling that the population has that there's some justice here, you are leaving in place the triggers for renewed conflict. And when you have a neighbor that's a predatory state like Russia, I think you just enhance the odds of that happening exponentially.
Thank you. You have the last word.
Thank you very much. I have a slightly more positive view of what was achieved at Dayton 30 years ago. For me, I weight the importance of ending that violence, which was really awful, very high. And I think as a consequence, when I look at Ukraine, I tend to lean a little bit more toward negotiation as an important element of our overall strategy. Obviously, coercion was also part of the story at Dayton. That's got to be part of it. But the willingness to talk to adversaries is, you can't end a war unless you're willing to do that at some point, and I couldn't agree with you more. These are not people who I want to sit down at the table with, but that's the job of diplomats. One other thing that we haven't talked about is that at Dayton, we had our allies behind us, which was very important in our capacity to achieve what we did achieve there, something which has been missing to some degree in the negotiations efforts that have been taking place over the course of the last few months. I mean, these are really tough decisions, right? For me, I'm glad that Dayton occurred and that the war did not continue. And I think in the extent to which we're in a similar position right now with Ukraine, we have to think about, well, if the war goes on, what confidence do we have that things are going to get better for the Ukrainians? And that's the issue that I really struggle with.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and commend them and compliment them on their expertise and express on behalf of the Helsinki Commission our appreciation for you sharing your thoughts with us and your wisdom. And feel free to continue giving information to us and advice, and we do appreciate it. And Congressman, unless you have some closing remarks, we stand adjourned. Thank you so much.